Your dog carried something across the house today. Maybe it was the chew you gave them an hour ago. Maybe a piece of kibble they fished out of the bowl. They moved with purpose, nose down, body low, and deposited it somewhere. Under a cushion, behind the couch, in the corner of the yard, and then they walked away from it. Just left it there. You probably assumed they were saving it for later. The way you might put something in the fridge. A reasonable explanation. A human explanation. And it turns out to be almost entirely wrong. There is a finding at the end of this that most owners will not expect. It is not about your dog's past or their instincts. It is about right now. It is about you. And once you understand it, you will not look at this behavior the same way again. Start with the explanation that seems obvious. Dogs are descended from wild canids. Wild canids experience feast and famine. When food is abundant, they cache the surplus. Scatter it across a territory so that no single location holds everything, so that if a rival finds one cache, the loss is not total. Behavioral ecologists have documented this across the canid family. Wolves, foxes, feral dogs operating at the edges of human settlements. The behavior is real. The ecological logic is sound, and it is the foundation of every surface-level explanation for why your dog buries bones. Store now, retrieve later. That part is not wrong, but it immediately creates a problem. Your dog does not live under conditions of food unpredictability. Their next meal is arriving whether they cache or not. So why does the behavior persist, and in some dogs intensify, in an animal that has never missed a meal in its life? The answer starts in genetics. Domestication reshaped the dog at a deep level. Research on the genetic divergence between wolves and domestic dogs, developed through studies across the 2010s by teams including those at Uppsala University, established that dogs were selected for reduced fear response, increased tolerance of human proximity, and a pull toward human-directed social behavior that wolves simply do not share. That selection pressure was real, and it was extensive. What it did not do was touch every behavioral system equally. The foraging and caching architecture, the neural circuitry that fires when an animal has something worth protecting, was not a target of domestication. It came through largely intact, which means your dog is running ancient hoarding software on a modern domestic life that does not require it. The instinct is there. The trigger conditions have changed, but the behavior fires anyway. Now, here is where the explanation most owners reach for. Competition turns out to be more complicated than it looks. In households with multiple dogs, caching seems to make intuitive sense. One dog hides food so the other cannot take it. Straightforward resource protection. But caching also appears regularly in single dog households, with no competitor present, no threat visible, nothing to protect against. The behavior does not require an actual rival. What research on canid social dynamics has established, through observational work on captive wolf groups at the Wolf Science Center in Vienna, is that it is perceived insecurity about resources, not actual competition, that drives caching frequency. Subordinate animals in those groups cached more often than dominant ones, not because they had more food, because they felt less certain about keeping what they had. The trigger is not the competitor. The trigger is the feeling that what you have might not stay yours. That is not rivalry behavior. That is anxiety behavior. And this changes what catching is actually measuring. The assumption most owners carry is that catching frequency tracks the food, how much there is, how appealing it is, how hungry the dog is at that moment. More food should mean more caching. High-value treat should mean more caching. But the evidence does not support that. What researchers have established through cognitive bias methodology, anchored in a landmark study by Harding, Paul, and Mendel at the University of Bristol in 2004, is that a dog's emotional state systematically shapes how they interpret and respond to their environment. Dogs in negative emotional states read ambiguous situations more pessimistically. They assess uncertainty differently. Their behavioral responses shift. The caching is not a food decision. It is an emotional signal, and what we need to understand is what, inside a domestic dog's daily life, is generating it. There is a layer here that catches most owners off guard. The assumption is that a dog doing something methodical, moving an object deliberately, nosing it into a specific location, pressing it down, must be in a calm state. Anxiety looks frantic. It looks like pacing and whining and destruction. It does not look like a dog carefully carrying a bone to 3 different spots before settling on one. But veterinary behavioral research has consistently described a category of low-level, chronic stress that does not present as obvious distress. It presents as purposeful, repetitive behavior, object manipulation, displacement foraging, hoarding. These are what ethologists, following the framework established by Nicholas Tinbergen in foundational comparative behavioral research, call displacement activities. They are real behaviors, driven by real internal arousal, that fire not because the situation calls for that specific action, but because the animal has unresolved internal tension and the catching motor pattern is available. The act provides temporary relief. Think about that. The food is not the point. The hiding is. Which means when a dog caches something, they do not retrieve. And they frequently do not, because spatial memory for cache locations in domestic dogs is demonstrably weaker than in corvids or rodents that rely on caching for survival. The incompleteness of the transaction is almost beside the point. The retrieval was never the function. The act of hiding was the resolution. Something needed to go somewhere, and the dog found a way to put it there. This reframes the behavior entirely, and it sets up the question the research eventually answers in a way that most owners find genuinely arresting. In 2019, researchers at Linköping University in Sweden measured long-term cortisol levels across 58 dog owner pairs. Not the cortisol spike of a difficult moment, the slow hormonal accumulation across weeks and months, captured through hair samples. What they found was that the levels were synchronized. Stressed owner, stressed dog, calm owner, calm dog. And when the researchers examined the direction of that relationship, which variable was leading the other, the data pointed one way. The owner's chronic stress baseline was predicting the dog's, not the reverse. Think about what that means for caching. A dog whose nervous system has been calibrated against yours, month after month, until your cortisol and theirs move in the same direction. That dog is not starting each day from neutral. They are starting from wherever you left them. And a dog already running above their baseline stress threshold is a dog whose displacement caching behavior has a lower trigger point. The same bone that would be eaten and forgotten in a regulated household becomes something to move, to hide, to return to, and move again. In a dog whose internal state is asking for resolution, it cannot find any other way. They do not know what has changed. They cannot name what they are responding to, but their nervous system has been reading yours, and it is responding to what it found. Your dog does not have language for what they are carrying, but they have this. They take what cannot be resolved in their body, and they bury it. They press it into the ground with their nose. They walk away, and sometimes they do not go back for it. Not because they forgot, because the going was the point. The next time you notice your dog caching more than usual, the instinct will be to look at what changed about the food. The research says to look somewhere else. If you want to understand the other ways your dog's body reads yours before you have said a word, that is what the next video is about.